Welcome to our deep dive into the often hilarious but sometimes alarming world of mistakes.
Hilarious and alarming. That's one way to put it.
We're going to be drawing insights from Why We Make Mistakes by Joseph T. Hallinan.
It's a fascinating look at those blunders we all make and why we make them.
And I've got an expert here with me to help us unpack some of the book's key ideas and draw out some of those so what implications for all of us.
It's packed with research and anecdotes. You'll never look at your own mistakes the same way again, I guarantee it.
Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to I got share a few examples from the book. They really grabbed me. Like, okay, imagine this. Anesthesiologists blowing themselves up in the operating room.
Yeah, that's in there. It sounds crazy, right?
It does. I mean, how does that even happen?
Well, it turns out even the most skilled professionals can make mistakes, especially under certain conditions.
It's a little unsettling to think about.
And then there's this. People failing to notice when the person they're talking to is completely switched mid-conversation.
Hold on. What? Seriously?
And most people can't even draw a penny from memory accurately.
Okay, now that one I could believe. I don't think I can do it either.
It all points to a central idea that Hallinan explores. So many of our errors stem from these, cognitive biases that operate outside of our conscious awareness.
Like our brains are playing tricks on us.
Kind of. We think we're in control, but these biases are subtly shaping our decisions all the time.
And get this. The book also dives into why men consistently report having more sexual partners than women.
That one raised my eyebrows, too.
But apparently it's not about actual behavior.
Nope. Memory bias plays a big role. But we'll get to that later.
All right, let's jump into the first section, huh? We're calling it The Invisible Forces Shaping Our Mistakes.
Hallinan kicks it off by talking about how deeply embedded these cognitive biases are in our thinking.
He uses first impressions as an example. Like, we all know they can be misleading,
Right.
but we still cling to them.
It's especially true in fields with a steep authority gradient, like medicine or aviation.
Oh, right, like where there's a clear hierarchy.
Exactly. So imagine a nurse or a junior staff member. They see a potential error, but they're hesitant to speak up because they don't want to question a senior doctor.
That's scary. That could have serious consequences.
And it has. But there's been a push to flatten that authority gradient.
To encourage everyone to speak up.
Yeah, to create a culture of if you see something, say something, and it's been shown to reduce errors.
That makes sense. It's like more eyes on the problem, the better. It reminds me of those change blindness experiments the book talks about, where people miss major changes happening right in front of them.
Right, like the gorilla walking across the basketball court.
Yes. We're so focused on one thing, we completely miss something else.
We're wired to see what we expect to see. Our brains develop these mental shortcuts to simplify things.
But sometimes those shortcuts lead us astray.
Exactly. And it can happen in everyday life, too. Think about when you're looking for something, say, a beer in the refrigerator.
Oh, I hate when that happens.
We tend to give up quickly if we think the thing we're looking for is unlikely to be there. It's like our brains say, nope, not there, move on.
It's frustrating, but it also kind of makes sense. Our brains are trying to be efficient.
Exactly. But it can lead to errors. And then there's the whole issue of framing.
How the way information is presented can influence our decisions, right?
Right. The book uses a pretty wild example. A guy mistook a porn DVD for a woman's cries for help.
Whoa, okay, that's a pretty strong example.
It just shows how powerful framing is. We see what we expect to see, hear what we expect to hear, based on the context.
Like, we fill in the blanks with our own assumptions.
And those assumptions can be way off. Hallinan also talks about a classic experiment by Kahneman and Tversky.
The behavioral economists.
Yeah. They found that people make different choices when the same problem is framed in terms of gains versus losses.
Even though the outcomes are mathematically the same.
Exactly. It's irrational, but it's how our brains work.
He also uses that example of the EntreMed stock.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one. Just because of a front-page news story, the stock price went through the roof.
But there was no real change in the company's prospects.
Yeah.
It was all about how the information was framed.
The media narrative, the hype, it created this perception of value where there really wasn't any.
And people bought it, literally.
It's a reminder that we're all susceptible to these framing effects, even when we think we're being rational.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it, how much of our decision-making is influenced by things outside of our awareness.
Yeah, it's a little unnerving, isn't it?
Definitely makes you think twice. But hey, that's what we're here for, right? To explore these hidden forces that shape our lives.
Exactly. And there's a lot more to uncover, ready to dive into the world of memory.
Let's do it.
All right, let's talk memory. Or should I say misremembered past?
Because our memories aren't always accurate.
Hallinan makes it clear that memory is not like a video recording. It's more of a reconstruction process.
So like a game of telephone where the story changes with each retelling.
Exactly. And one big reason for that is that memory prioritizes meaning over detail.
We remember the gist, not necessarily the specifics.
Right. Like think about trying to draw a penny from memory. Most people can't do it accurately.
Yeah, I probably couldn't either. I know it's round and copper-colored, but beyond that.
Exactly. We have the general idea, but not the fine details. It's like remembering the plot of a movie, but forgetting the names of the minor characters.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And speaking of remembering things, Hallinan also talks about the importance of context. Like, we remember things better when we're in the same state as when we learn them.
Yeah, the studies are pretty wild. People remember information better if they're wet, dry, or even intoxicated.
So you're saying if I learned something while tipsy, I'd remember it better if I had a drink?
That's what the research suggests, but I'm not recommending it as a study technique.
Noted. I guess that explains why I'm so bad with names. They just feel so arbitrary.
That's a common problem. Names often lack a meaningful context for us, so they're hard to store in our memory. Hallinan even talks about how Joe Theismann, the famous quarterback, forgot the name of his own coach, Joe Gibbs.
Oh, wow. Even happens to the pros. Our brains seem to prioritize information that's meaningful and relevant to our lives.
Absolutely. And now for a real doozy hindsight bias. Knowing the outcome of something makes it seem more predictable than it actually was.
The I knew it all along phenomenon.
Exactly. Hallinan uses Nixon's trips to China and Russia as examples.
Before the trips, there was all this speculation about what might happen.
But afterwards, knowing the outcome, people thought it was more inevitable than it really was.
Like looking back on a maze and thinking there was only one path to the end.
And it even affects experts. Historians, even with all their knowledge, fall prey to hindsight bias.
So even those who study the past have trouble seeing events with the same uncertainty that existed at the time.
Our current understanding colors our perception of history. Makes it tough to truly grasp the contingencies of the past.
Fascinating stuff. And now, let's tackle a topic I've been looking forward to. Those intriguing gender differences in how we make mistakes.
You mean like the finding that men consistently report more sexual partners than women?
That's the one. As we mentioned earlier, memory bias plays a big part.
It's not necessarily about actual behavior, but how men and women recall and categorize past experiences.
And it ties into another interesting gender difference, risk-taking, especially when it comes to finances.
Right. Men trade stocks way more frequently than women, often driven by overconfidence. They think they can beat the market.
Kind of like how men get more speeding tickets, a need for action, a sense of control, even if it's an illusion.
And just like speeding can lead to trouble, so can excessive trading. Men often end up with lower returns than women because of all that buying and selling.
So patience and a more cautious approach can actually pay off. Who knew?
It shows the importance of being calibrated, meaning how well our perceived abilities match up with our actual performance.
And the book says most of us are pretty bad at that, especially with complex tasks.
Yeah, he uses an example from the Army. Soldiers consistently overestimated their shooting accuracy.
But there's one group that's really good at calibration. Weather forecasters.
Because they get constant feedback. They see how their predictions match up with reality, and they adjust accordingly.
So feedback is key to keeping our overconfidence in check.
It forces us to confront how we're actually doing, not just how we think we're doing.
Makes sense. Hallinan also talks about how gender differences extend to something as basic as navigation.
Right, the classic stereotype of men refusing to ask for directions. Even little boys are less likely to ask for help finding their way.
It's not just stubbornness, is it?
Hallinan explores how it's rooted in early childhood experiences and societal norms. Boys are often encouraged to be independent, to explore on their own.
While girls are often taught to seek help, which might make them less confident in their own navigational skills.
And these early patterns can affect our confidence and decision-making in all sorts of areas later in life. Fascinating stuff, right?
Absolutely. I'm learning so much about how our minds work and how they sometimes lead us astray.
There's so much more to explore, ready to dig deeper.
So it seems like these biases, these mental shortcuts, are like baked into how we think and make decisions.
That's right. And understanding them is crucial, especially if we want to avoid those potentially negative consequences.
The book uses examples like our tendency to overestimate our abilities, especially when it comes to tough tasks.
It's called the illusion of control. Hallinan describes these experiments where people thought they could influence random events, like flipping a coin.
Like we crave that sense of agency, even in situations where it doesn't exist.
And it can even extend to knowledge. The more information we have, the more knowledgeable we feel. But is it real knowledge?
Hallinan talks about those studies where condensed summaries were just as effective or even better than the longer versions.
It's a good reminder that more information doesn't always equal more understanding.
And all this overconfidence, this illusion of control, can lead us down some dangerous paths, especially when it comes to finances.
The book uses gym memberships as an example. People consistently overestimate how much they'll actually go to the gym.
We sign up for those yearly contracts convinced we'll be there every other day.
But then life gets in the way. Motivation fades.
And we end up paying way more than we would have with a pay-per-visit option.
Our present selves, full of good intentions, don't always predict our future behavior very accurately.
It's that disconnect between what we intend to do and what we actually end up doing. Hallinan calls it calibration.
It's about how well our perceived abilities match up with our actual performance.
And sadly, most of us are pretty poorly calibrated, especially when it comes to complicated tasks.
The book has this sobering example from the Army. Soldiers were asked to rate their shooting accuracy. They were way off.
Overconfident, huh?
Big time. But there's one group that consistently demonstrates good calibration. Weather forecasters.
Why is that?
Because they get constant feedback. They see how their predictions line up with the actual weather, and they can adjust their thinking.
Feedback is crucial, then, for keeping our overconfidence in check.
It makes us face reality, not just rely on our often inflated self-assessments.
And speaking of reality checks, Hallinan talks about how a lack of constraints can contribute to errors, especially in high-stakes situations.
Like the case of the Quaid twins. They were almost fatally overdosed with heparin because the vials were too easy to mix up.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember hearing about that. A terrible mistake.
The vials lacked clear constraints, so even though the medical staff was trained, they made a mistake.
It's a stark reminder that even in systems designed for safety, human error can slip through the cracks.
And that's why designing systems to prevent errors is so important. Clear labeling, standardized procedures, multiple checks and balances.
It makes sense. And it connects to what Hallinan says about learning from experience. We don't always extract the right lessons from our mistakes.
We might misattribute the cause, or fail to see patterns that could help us avoid the same mistake in the future.
And the book also highlights the dangers of a fear of making mistakes, especially in education.
When students are taught that mistakes are failures, it stifles learning.
It creates this, aversion to risk.
Yeah.
They're less likely to experiment or try new things.
And that fear of failure can carry over into adulthood, preventing us from embracing new approaches or challenging the status quo.
Like they say, if you're not making mistakes, you're not trying hard enough.
Exactly. We need to see mistakes as part of the learning process. It's essential for growth, both personally and professionally.
And Hallinan offers some practical advice for making fewer errors. Things like slowing down, avoiding multitasking, and getting enough sleep.
Those might sound simple, but they address some of the core cognitive challenges we face.
Like, multitasking isn't really a thing. Our brains are just switching between tasks rapidly.
Which leads to less focus and more mistakes.
And sleep deprivation, even though our culture often glorifies it, actually impairs judgment and makes us more likely to take risks.
It's like driving under the influence. Our cognitive functions are compromised, but we might not even realize it.
And finally, Hallinan dives into how our emotions can affect our decision-making.
You're talking about the research showing that happiness can actually boost problem-solving abilities?
That a positive mood makes us more likely to think creatively and find innovative solutions.
That's right. It's like happiness unlocks a different way of thinking. We see possibilities that we might not have noticed in a neutral or negative state.
So cultivating happiness, whether through simple acts of kindness or pursuing meaningful goals, can have a ripple effect, improving not just our well-being, but our cognitive function too.
Absolutely. This deep dive into the world of mistakes has been pretty eye-opening. It's made me more aware of all the hidden forces that shape our perceptions and choices.
Me too. It's a bit humbling, to be honest.
It is. And while we might never completely eliminate mistakes from our lives, understanding these forces is a step towards minimizing their impact.
It's an ongoing journey of self-reflection and challenging our assumptions.
As we wrap up this exploration of why we make mistakes, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. Knowing that we're all prone to these biases and shortcuts, what practical steps can we take to lessen their influence on our daily decisions?
That's a great question. Something to think about. And for those who want a quick recap of the key takeaways, here's a 10-point summary.
Number one, we're often unaware of the cognitive biases that lead us to make mistakes.
Number 2, first impressions are powerful and hard to shake, even when we know they might be wrong.
Number three, the way information is framed can dramatically influence our choices.
Number 4, memory focuses on meaning over detail, which is why we remember the gist but forget specifics.
Number five, hindsight bias makes events seem more predictable than they were, leading us to rewrite history in our minds.
Number 6, men tend to be more overconfident than women, which can result in riskier behavior and potentially lower returns in areas like investing.
Number seven, regular feedback is crucial for aligning our perceived abilities with our actual performance.
Number 8, early childhood experiences shape our navigation strategies and confidence in wayfinding.
Number nine, even experts are susceptible to cognitive biases, highlighting the need for systems that mitigate human error.
And number 10, understanding our limitations and the unseen forces that shape our decisions is the first step towards making fewer mistakes.
That concludes our deep dive into the fascinating and often humbling world of human error. May your future decisions be a little wiser, a little more insightful, and hopefully a little less mistake-prone.
Until our next exploration, keep those minds curious and those critical thinking skills sharp.